The phone rang during my mother's funeral. I stood before her casket, my eyes lingering for a few final moments on the polished wood's sheen. The cold surface beneath my fingertips felt unexpectedly sharp and distinct, as if trying to anchor me in the reality of what was happening. My phone buzzed against my hip, breaking the silence of the room filled with murmured condolences and muted sobs. The screen lit up with a name, Debbie Brooks. My mother-in-law. Of course, her impeccable sense of timing, as always. I let the call go to voicemail, suppressing my irritation. But the phone rang again. And again. On the third ring, I finally stepped away from the casket, my hands trembling, and walked into the empty hallway of the funeral home. "Dear, I've been trying to reach you," Debbie's voice dripped from the speaker, sickly sweet. "We're having a family gathering next Saturday. I expect you and Greg to be there." The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed as I processed her words. "Debbie, I'm at my mother's funeral right now," I said, my throat tightening with a mix of grief and anger. "Oh, today?" She paused, a cold silence filled with feigned regret. "Well, I'm sorry, dear, but life goes on. Saturday is very important. The whole family will be there. I have something special to announce." My free hand clenched into a fist on its own. Through the doorway, I spotted my brother, Jason. His face was as pale as it had been when we found Mom in her final moments together. He didn't need to say anything, his eyes conveyed everything. "I'm not sure I can make it," I said into the phone, trying to keep my voice steady. "Oh, don't be silly," Debbie interrupted. "Your mother wouldn't want you wallowing in grief. Besides, Greg needs your support. You want to support your husband, don't you?" The manipulation was so transparent it might have been laughable if it weren't so cruel. I pressed my forehead against the cool wall, recalling my mother's words. She always told me to stand up for myself, but what good were those words when faced with someone like Debbie? "I need to check with Greg," I tried. "Oh, he's already confirmed," she said briskly. "I spoke to him this morning." She had cornered my husband between her iron will and my grief, folding him into something fragile and compliant. I loved Greg, but his ability to stand up to his mother had always been questionable. "I'll think about it," I replied, knowing full well it would spark her ire. "Aya," Debbie's voice sharpened like a blade, "this isn't a request. I've already told everyone you'll be there. Don't disgrace the family." The family. Her family. As if my own mourning and loss didn't matter. My mother hadn't even been laid to rest, yet Debbie was, as always, demanding her way. "I have to go," I cut her off. "Saturday at 6, she continued, ignoring me. "Wear something appropriate. Not black." The line disconnected before I could respond. I stared at the phone, feeling something inside me crack. My carefully held composure fractured. Jason stepped closer and placed a warm hand on my shoulder. "Debbie?" he asked. I nodded, feeling drained. "What does the witch want this time?" "Family gathering on Saturday. Apparently, I'm required to attend. Or I'll shame the Brooks dynasty." Jason's jaw tightened. "Tell her to go to hell." I wish I could. I glanced toward the casket surrounded by roses, the kind Mom would have hated. She always loved wildflowers, untamed and free. "Greg needs to grow a spine and stand up to his mother," Jason said, gripping my shoulder tighter. "Mom wanted better for you. Remember what she always said about people who mistake kindness for weakness?" I nodded, but I didn't have time to respond. The funeral director gestured that it was time. As Jason and I walked back into the room where everyone had gathered to say their final goodbyes, I felt something crystallize within me. It wasn't just the pain of loss, it was something else. A cold, searing anger brewed in my chest. Mom had always taught me to be strong and kind, but never to let others trample over me. And yet, here I was, at her funeral, letting Debbie Brooks walk all over me. Mom's body hadn't even been laid to rest, and Debbie was already planning how to manipulate me next. Maybe it was grief. Maybe it was rage. But as I watched my mother's casket slowly lower into the ground, I made a decision. Debbie wants me at her important gathering? Fine. I'll be there. But not as the obedient, meek daughter-in-law she's used to seeing. It's time to show her the kind of person my mother raised. Greg's message came through just as I finished packing up the last of my mother's things from her studio. It was curt, as if it were something trivial. The art supplies need to be in Portland tonight. Client has an urgent return. I'll be back Friday evening before Mom's dinner. Sorry. Love you. I looked at the sable brushes in my hands. They were her favorites, and now they felt impossibly heavy. Of course, he had to leave. Of course, it had to happen this week. I carefully set the brushes down before anger completely overtook me and glanced at Jason, who stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. Daylight streamed through the window, catching the dark strands of his hair. Client emergency, he said with a bitter smirk. Convenient timing, isn't it? You mean Debbie's timing? I replied, casting a glance at one of Mom's half-finished canvases. Bet she orchestrated the whole thing, Jason said, nodding toward my phone. I grabbed it and started dialing Debbie's number but stopped suddenly. What could I even say? Did you send my husband away on purpose so I'd be left to grieve alone? She would deny everything. Worse, she'd probably convince Greg that I was becoming paranoid. She'll just say you're unstable, Jason warned, watching the conflict on my face. That's exactly what she wants. The studio suddenly felt stiflingly small. Mom's presence was everywhere and nowhere at the same time. Her easel stood empty in the corner. Her coffee mug still sat on the table. The windowsill was smeared with dried paint. All of it needed to be packed away, but right now, I needed air. I'm stepping outside for a minute, I muttered, heading to the backyard. The phone buzzed again. The name on the screen made me flinch, Emily, Greg's younger sister. We'd never been particularly close, but after Mom passed, she'd sent a condolence card. That was more than Debbie had done. Aya, are you okay? Her voice sounded almost genuine. I just found out Greg left. I'm fine, I lied automatically. Just finishing up packing Mom's studio. I can come help, she offered. By the way, I wanted to give you a heads up. Something's happening on Saturday. Something big. A sinking feeling twisted in my stomach. What kind of something? Emily lowered her voice. I'm not supposed to say anything, but Debbie's planning to announce the sale of Henry's gallery. The world seemed to tilt around me. Henry owned the gallery where Mom's work had been displayed for years. It was where Greg and I had met during one of her openings. It was also where Debbie had first expressed her disdain for me, the daughter of a failed artist who had somehow caught her son's attention. Did Henry agree to this? My voice sounded foreign to me. Dad doesn't even know yet, Emily said, her voice shaky. She's presenting it as a done deal. She says it's time to modernize the family legacy. I gripped the cold metal of the garden fence, feeling tiny splinters bite into my palm. The pain was faint but grounding, reminding me this wasn't some terrible dream. Did Greg know? Of course not. No one knew, except me and Mom. And even I only knew because I'd overheard Debbie on the phone. She'd been so engrossed in discussing the deal's details with the buyers that she hadn't even noticed me standing nearby. Aya, Emily's voice came cautiously over the line. There are other buyers. They want to convert the gallery into office space. All the local artists who exhibit there will lose their space. Including your Mom's retrospective next month. It's her last chance to share her art with the world. I froze. My mother's work, her life, her soul poured into every canvas, and it was all about to vanish? To be replaced by sterile office walls? Thank you for telling me, I managed to say. Be careful, Aya, Emily warned, her voice earnest. Mom's been different lately. More controlling. Especially since Dad started talking about retirement. After hanging up, I surveyed my mother's garden. She'd loved her wildflowers, the very ones Debbie had once dismissively called weeds. At that family dinner, Mom had only smiled and replied, "Some people just don't understand the difference between strength and pretense." My hand clenched into a fist instinctively as I redialed, this time calling Jason. "Remember when you said I should tell Debbie to go to hell?" I began, my voice cold and steady. I think I found the right moment. "What happened?" His tone was sharp. "She's selling Henry's gallery." Without telling him. That's going to be her important announcement at Saturday's dinner. Jason let out a low whistle. Even for her, that's cold. "She's not just erasing Mom's memory, Jason," I said, feeling the anger rise in me like a tidal wave. "She's destroying what Henry loves and the gallery's value to the local art community. And she sent Greg to Portland so he couldn't interfere. What are you going to do?" I looked through the window at Mom's empty studio. Her garden was full of strength masked by delicate beauty. "I'm going to that dinner," I said, my gaze settling on the wildflowers. "And I'm bringing everything to prove the gallery's worth. Mom's sales reports, press articles, everything." "You're going to take on Debbie Brooks?" I gently touched one of the flowers, its petals soft, but the stem firm and unyielding. "I'm going to save Henry's gallery. And if Debbie ends up in the crossfire, well, it'll be deserved, won't it?" Saturday arrived, weighing on me like a funeral shroud. I pulled up to the Carter's house 15 minutes early. Mom's sales reports and gallery press clippings sat in my bag like ammunition. Debbie's house loomed ahead, all Victorian pretension and ostentatious wealth. Aunt Margaret's car was already parked in the driveway. I froze with my hand on the car door. Aunt Margaret. Debbie's sister and personal herald, the same woman who'd spread rumors that I'd trapped Greg into marriage with my mother's connections. Suddenly, Emily appeared beside my car window. I jumped. She tapped on the glass, and I rolled it down. "Mom's in a particularly foul mood tonight," she whispered. "She's already made the housekeeper cry." "Perfect," I muttered, stepping out of the car and smoothing my dress. It was definitely not black, as instructed. "Is your dad here?" I asked. Emily shook her head. "No, working late at the gallery. Mom said it was better for everyone that way." Her mouth twisted with resentment, and I knew she was thinking the same thing I was. Debbie was controlling everything and everyone, as usual. Together, we approached the massive front door. Taking a deep breath, I knocked, bracing myself for the battle ahead. As usual, we walked side by side. Gravel crunched beneath our feet as we made our way along the path to the house. The branches of the trees almost touched each other overhead, their shadows making the air cool and heavy. Through the front window, I saw Aunt Margaret, gesturing animatedly as she spoke to the assembled group. My stomach tightened as I recognized her audience. Prescott. She owned 3 galleries downtown, the very ones I suspected Debbie planned to use for all future exhibits, including my mother's work. I whispered Prescott's name to Emily, who nodded, her eyes momentarily dark. Mom had spent weeks nurturing relationships with these people, hosting events, discussing possibilities. And now it could all vanish in an instant if Prescott wanted it. When we entered the house, Debbie was already waiting for us in the living room. She sat in an armchair, clearly ready to receive her guests. Dressed in a sleek designer dress that undoubtedly cost more than my car, she looked at me with mild displeasure, as though I'd violated some unspoken rule. The dress was like a crown on her, a declaration that she was in charge. Her eyes landed on me, narrowing like a predator sizing up its prey. "Ah, dear," she said with a frosty tone, early as always. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed, feeling her attention center squarely on me. I wondered if she'd noticed that my steps were more confident, my expression harder. Maybe her calm had once seemed unshakable, but now I could feel the walls between us beginning to crack. "I've learned from the best," I replied, flashing her a toothy smile. "You always say punctuality shows respect, especially for family." Debbie paused, her gaze sharpening. Something flickered across her expression, almost imperceptible, but I caught it. Was it surprise? Or suspicion? She didn't reply immediately, as if she needed a moment to gauge my words. Her silence was heavy, and I stood there, watching her, observing how she calculated her next move, weighing the words she was about to say. Her tone shifted, becoming cautious. "You think you can interfere in our affairs," she finally said, her voice barely a whisper meant only for me. But I knew her words were intentional, calculated. I felt my pulse pounding in my temples. Interfere? The word, dripping with disdain, ignited something deeper within me than mere defiance. I didn't need to interfere. I was already part of this game, whether Debbie acknowledged it or not. She might think she controlled every move on the board, but I was no pawn. "I'm not interfering," I replied without flinching. "I'm simply doing what I must." Her eyes narrowed slightly, but the smug glint I was so used to seeing was gone. What replaced it was sharp and probing. She clearly hadn't expected this. "You spent years dismissing artists like my mother," I said, stepping closer, my resolve solidifying with every word. "Treating art as a flaw of character. But do you know what really frightens you, Debbie? It's that people like us can see through you. That we perceive truths your money can't buy or control." The words spilled out like heavy stones, and for the first time, her faint smile vanished. Her expression hardened, her eyes growing colder than ever. She stepped closer to me, her voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You ungrateful little—" The words hissed through her teeth with such icy contempt that I felt my chest constrict. She paused as though ready to strike when the door suddenly opened. Henry walked in. Paint stains covered his hands and clothes, evidence of his immersion in work. He carried a stack of papers, heavy in his grip, and his expression was unreadable. Where his gaze had once held warmth and understanding, it now carried tension. His presence shifted the room's atmosphere. Without a word, he placed the papers on the table, his look speaking volumes. "Henry," I said, barely containing my anger, my challenge clear and deliberate. "What's going on here?" Debbie's face turned ashen, the blood draining from it, and for a fleeting moment, I saw real fear in her eyes. But it wasn't fear of losing the gallery, it was something deeper. The fear of losing control. The control she had clung to so tightly for so long. In that moment, standing before her, I realized this was only the beginning. The fallout of Henry's arrival exploded like a bomb in slow motion. Everything that had led up to this moment had been building to this, and now, there was no turning back. Debbie's life had been built on control, and now it was unraveling. Later, as I sat in my car outside my mother's empty house, the silence was oppressive. The home we had once shared was now vacant. My hands gripped the steering wheel, trembling. There was no trace of her left inside, only the remnants of her life. Mom. Mom had been the one to teach me to fight, to never give up. And now, her place had been taken by shadows, just faint echoes on the old walls. I remembered her last words to me, whispered by the window, almost as though she'd known I'd need the strength to face this fight. I looked out at the empty yard, and something inside me crumbled. I didn't yet know what lay ahead, but standing there before that house, I knew I couldn't back down. Everything until now had been preparation for the moment when I would take control of my own life. The coffee cup in my hand crumpled, its hot liquid spilling onto my fingers, scalding my skin, though I barely felt it. The burning pain was insignificant compared to the fire consuming me from within. My vision blurred, the emptiness around me closing in. Henry's words echoed like ash in the wind, their weight dissolving, leaving only traces. "You knew she planned to sell the gallery?" I asked, my voice low, the question hanging heavily in the air. "Not exactly," he replied, his lips trembling slightly. "She just said changes were coming, that it would be better if you stayed out of it." He reached toward me, his presence thickening the air between us, his breathing heavy, as if the weight of the moment pressed down on him, too. I tightened my grip on the cup, my fingers widening from the pressure. I was fighting to protect my mother's legacy, her art, everything she had created and left for me. I shook off the invisible fear clinging to me. You conspired with her? I asked, my voice trembling with restrained emotion. The question carried no accusation, but its weight was undeniable. The evidence looked real. Dates, signatures, photographs, all of it coalesced into something that seemed definitive. And I realized then that Henry was part of it. He had been part of the game, one that had perhaps been going on for a long time. Aya, his voice was soft, but that made it no easier. You can't win this battle. It's not your war. I closed my eyes, overwhelmed by a tide of emotions. My voice trembled as I spoke. Please, just let me leave. He stepped back, raising his hands in a gesture of surrender. His gaze was filled with the same silent despair I'd seen in my own reflection as I left the house earlier. He looked at me one last time, his face growing mute and blank. I didn't know what to think, but one thing was clear, his decision was already made. I watched as his car slowly disappeared into the distance, its wheels carrying him far away from me. The rear window fogged over, yet I couldn't look away. I saw him fading from my life like a shadow impossible to chase. Seconds stretched into minutes, and I stood frozen, as if trapped, unable to move. In the rearview mirror, my reflection blurred and distorted as my thoughts spiraled into chaos. That same inevitable dread churned inside me. At that moment, as the fog closed in on my reality, my phone vibrated. Greg. Right at the brink. I glanced at the screen but didn't answer. We were supposed to meet in an hour. The phone buzzed again. Greg. I turned it off. Each notification from him felt like an unbearable weight, as if he were an invisible wasp circling, refusing to leave me alone. But Henry's words still echoed in my mind, hard and cold like a steel blade. She doesn't know you're not aware of it yet. His voice had merged with the hum of my thoughts. But she'll know when the police get involved. I froze the sale agreement she tried to push through. I forged your signature. It's fraud, Aya. She's accusing you of committing a crime. I froze. Everything inside me turned upside down. Forging my signature? The police? Henry stood before me like a stone pillar, unmoving, but his words carried the weight of iron. He had just shattered what, until yesterday, had seemed unshakable, trust and closeness. He looked at me as though waiting for a response, but I couldn't say anything. Silence filled the space. At that moment, the gallery door burst open. Emily rushed in, her face flushed with urgency, her eyes wide. Before I could look up, she was speaking. Mom's calling an emergency family meeting tomorrow night. She's going to tell everyone how they manipulated Dad into turning against you. Let her try. I started to say something, but Emily cut me off, her words spilling out like bullets. She has recordings of phone calls between you and Jason. You can't imagine how it looks. In those recordings, you're discussing all these plans about manipulating the gallery. She's painting you as the mastermind behind everything. My laughter, unnaturally sharp, broke the frozen silence, echoing in the still space like a brittle sound that didn't match reality, or my own emotions. Laughing felt absurd, but what else could I do? Of course, she did it. Of course, she took advantage of the fact that I had once trusted her. Something sharp pierced my chest, and I felt my heart clench, but I couldn't stop. She's doing this because God forbid I lose everything, I said, my voice carrying a note of infinite exhaustion. My hand dropped limply, as if in defeat. She'll do it all. With them. Emily stood in front of me, a resolute wall, unable to fully grasp what I was going through. How could she? She looked at me with concern, her expression ready for a fight. And me? What could I do? Expose Debbie, rip away what she had built to gain control over everything? Or stand silently and wait while she took away what mattered most to me? Henry stood nearby, his face betraying no surprise. As always, he was as cold as everything else involving his family. We were all entangled in this conflict, but despite Emily's words, I felt as though I might never see the truth. I felt Emily squeeze my hand under the table. Her palm was cold and trembling, but I didn't pull mine away. We both knew that everything happening now would lead to inevitable consequences. Emily's gaze was filled with determination, as always when she decided we would no longer be treated like children. You mean when I exposed your forged gallery contracts? The words spilled out before I could stop them. I hadn't planned to say it, but the truth was out now, and there was no stopping it. We all sat in silence, the weight of every sound amplified in the oppressive atmosphere. Debbie, as always, maintained her composure. She pointed at me as though I were some insignificant obstacle easily buried in the dirt. Her face remained calm, but in her eyes, I saw something unusual. These weren't the eyes of a victor, they were the eyes of someone willing to do anything to retain control. These paranoid accusations, her voice was steady but barely audible, unstable behavior, stealing confidential gallery documents. Grief can do terrible things to a person's mind. She spoke those words like a mantra, repeating her phrases as if she truly believed them. I could feel the tension in the room building, like a knife slowly sinking deeper into my wounds with each of her words. Greg, sitting next to me, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. I had long since gotten used to his silence in these moments. He was a coward. He always had been. Play the recordings, Emily said, her voice now firm as iron. Debbie fell silent for a moment, her gaze glinting, but she quickly straightened up, forcing herself to appear confident. Those recordings you claim prove manipulation? Emily didn't back down. I could feel the strain in her voice pulling her down, but she kept going. And I kept going too. We were opponents, and there was no point in avoiding that. Emily and I had long been on the same side, despite everything that had happened between us. They're not necessary, Debbie said, her smile faltering suddenly. It was terrifying. It was terrifying to see someone who had always controlled everything around them begin to lose their grip. I pulled out my phone, took it from my pocket, and turned on the recording. This was my moment. Actually, they are, I said quietly but firmly, looking directly into her eyes. We can compare the recordings. Greg turned pale, his face as white as a canvas, and a strange confusion appeared in his eyes, as though he suddenly realized his little empire of lies was crumbling before him. Enough, Greg said loudly, his voice echoing in the room. Both of you, stop. I began to say something, but he interrupted me, his gaze hard, but lacking certainty, only fear. I found something in the studio, he said, and his words hung in the air like a storm cloud, ready to unleash its fury. I looked back at the X-rays, those old, almost forgotten images, where beneath layers of paint were the distinctive brushstrokes of my mother. This was her mark, her secret language, which I was only just beginning to truly understand. The truth she had left me, as a legacy, as her final gift. And now, looking at those strokes, I felt the truth waiting for its moment, like a volcano ready to erupt. My mother had taught me that the truth had to be uncovered gradually, layer by layer, and that one should never be afraid to show it to people, no matter how they would react. You're right, I said quietly, pressing the phone to my ear, not taking my eyes off the screen. This has to end. I took out my second phone and, without hesitation, pressed the play button. Debbie's voice, filled with cold confidence, instantly filled the room. Of course, I forged Henry's signature. He's too sentimental about these things. The gallery. Sometimes you have to make people accept changes. Her words, spoken with such a light, calculating tone, made the air around us feel as heavy as lead. But this time, I was ready. I watched the color drain from Debbie's face, her confidence starting to melt away, as if her own words had condemned her. Her jaw quivered slightly, but she still tried to maintain control. Her eyes, filled with fear and contempt, met mine, and I felt the tension between us become almost palpable. I paused, giving her a moment to comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened. But I wasn't finished. This was only the first step, only the beginning of what I had planned. I took out the second phone from my pocket and sent copies of the recordings to Henry's lawyer. A few minutes before this happened, I caught Greg's stunned gaze. He sat across from me, unable to say anything, his face as white as someone caught in the eye of a storm, not knowing how to react. "Sometimes, you have to make people face the truth," I said, looking him directly in the eyes, with such determination that the words needed no further explanation. The room erupted into chaos. Voices clashed, people began to rise, their movements showing their emotions. But I didn't care. I watched it all unfold as if it were a distant spectacle that had nothing to do with me. My mother was no longer here, but I felt her presence in these walls, in this moment. And for the first time since she had gone, I felt completely at peace. I had done what I needed to do. Now, let everyone choose their side. The police arrived a few hours after my revelation. I knew this would happen. I heard the sirens, saw them pull up to the house, their figures in bright vests moving across the yard like shadows. And though I knew the consequences of this step would be enormous, I felt neither fear nor doubt. It was decided. It was done. I stood in place, like a statue, watching this restless, brutal, but inevitable process unfold. And while everyone around me shouted, argued, and tried to accuse one another, I was ready to stand in this storm. Because I was no longer the woman who hid the truth. I was the one who brought it, no matter the scars it might leave. My mother would have been proud of me. I stepped back, feeling the distance between us like something physical. It wasn't just an emotional divide, it was a barrier I had built to protect myself, and now it felt like a concrete wall. My chest tightened, and a storm began to rise inside me. The words, the accusations I had just uttered, hung in the air like heavy stones that could not be discarded. Greg stood across from me, his face now colorless, like someone who had suddenly realized the full weight of what was happening. His eyes darted around the room, unable to find any refuge, and it seemed like he wanted to say something, but his voice faded away, like dust in the desert. His words were barely audible, and I could sense the despair in his tone. "Can we? Because your mother is facing criminal charges, your father is filing for divorce, and you still can't admit she was wrong?" His gaze was full of pain, as if he were trying to find even the slightest justification for his own actions in my eyes, but there was none. I clenched my fists, feeling my nails digging into my skin. I had already gone through all these questions with myself. I already understood that my mother, despite all her efforts, had done not only many good things but had also made incredibly many mistakes. She was not perfect. She was too strong to be perfect, and too vulnerable not to make mistakes. I admit she went too far, I exhaled, as if something had finally lifted off me. But the laugh that escaped from me was cruel. It was sharp, like broken glass, shattering everything around. Too far. Greg stood there, unsure of what to do with this silence, with this new reality. I looked into his eyes, and in them, I saw a mix of pain and confusion. He still couldn't understand why I hadn't thrown myself into his arms, why I wasn't seeking comfort in his words. "She tried to ruin my mother's reputation," I continued, no longer paying attention to what I was saying. "She forged documents, manipulated everyone around her, including you. You weren't an exception, Greg. That's not too far. That's who she was." At that moment, like a thunderclap, there was a knock at the studio door. We both jumped in surprise. I turned around and saw Emily standing in the doorway, her face contorted with tears rolling down her cheeks, leaving wet trails. She looked lost, but there was resolve in her gaze. She was not afraid to speak the truth, no matter how painful it was. "They found more," she said with a heavy sigh, and I felt the air around us tighten again. "In my mother's office, years of forged documents, contract manipulations. She'd been doing it for decades, Greg." Emily's words, like mine, left no room for justification. I saw Greg stagger, as though he'd been struck. His face turned pale, and in his eyes, there appeared the same vacant look I had seen in people who had experienced something too terrifying to grasp immediately. "This is impossible," he whispered, as though he had just confronted something that was destroying his world. "The gallery sale wasn't the first time, Em." His words sounded like he was trying to find an excuse, like one small detail, one tiny part of his reality, could set everything back in place. But I knew it wouldn't. The gallery. The world in which he lived, in which we were all tied together, it was crumbling, like a house of cards with no foundation, no meaning left. Emily came over to me, her hands trembling, but I saw resolve in her eyes. We stood together, both understanding that nothing would be the same anymore, that this entire life, this lie we had tried so hard to conceal, was about to become part of our history, part of something that could never be undone. You realize, now this can't be stopped. Her voice was almost a whisper, but it was filled with strength. I nodded, feeling the power return to me. It had to end. My hands shook as I read, each word felt heavy, as though it were carved in stone. On the back of the photograph my mother had left me, there was a note, barely noticeable, like a mysterious signature on an ancient map leading to treasures I hadn't even known about. My dear girl, by now you have probably faced your own wildflowers. This choice between submitting to the expectations of others or growing wild and true, remember, the strongest flowers are those that break through concrete. I pressed my palm to my chest, trying to calm the frantic pulse that had not let go of me since I left the gallery. My mother's words seemed to penetrate through me, flooding my whole body, stopping my breath. Everything she had ever said to me was coming back now, at this moment, as though she had foreseen what I was about to do. This was her final lesson. She hadn't taught me to fear. She had taught me to fight. And if I had to choose between fear and truth, I already knew what I would choose. I lifted my gaze and noticed Greg standing at the entrance of the gallery. His figure was so familiar, yet at the same time alien. He looked lost, as always, but now in his eyes, I saw something else, desperation, merging with his usual timidity. He was in his tailor-made suit, which couldn't conceal what was going on inside him, the battle he was fighting with himself. Greg had been living with Emily since Debbie's arrest. He had tried to escape what her manipulation had left him with, decades of control that, as I now understood, were not meant to keep our home intact, but to use us. All this time, he had been in a game that didn't concern him, playing a role that had been forced upon him. I knew his words hadn't always been his own, that in his tone, there had been fear and uncertainty. He had lived with the thought that everything could somehow be fixed, that if everything was quiet, if everything followed the rules, he would be back in his place. She offered a plea deal, he said quietly, not meeting my eyes, as if he was ashamed of ever agreeing to it. She took it well. I silently stared at him, and his words sounded hollow, like an echo. Well? What did that even mean when her words left no trace in his soul? When every step he took was just another part of a game he had been dragged into? It became clear to me that for him, this was neither a victory nor a defeat, it was simply a trap. And he kept falling into that trap again and again, not realizing that, in reality, he was losing himself. I thought about what you said about choosing sides. There are no neutral positions in this world, no gray areas where one can hide. Every choice defines you. It doesn't matter what you did before, what lay behind your actions. At some point, everything comes to light, and then you have to admit that it was you who decided who you were going to be. Greg took a step closer but kept a safe distance. His steps were uncertain, but there was no longer the full trust that had been there before. Now he was cautious, like someone who had stumbled once and didn't want to make the same mistake again. I felt the space between us had grown bigger than just physical distance. We weren't just standing at opposite ends of the room, we were standing in different worlds, each built on choices that might never intersect. I'm starting therapy to learn to see patterns, he said, as though that was somehow supposed to change the course of our conversation. I'm glad. I'm trying to sort this out. But I knew that words, like actions, couldn't be so simple. Sorting it out wasn't that easy. It took more than just therapy. It took strength he might never have gained. And now he was trying to find answers he couldn't find before. Did he really think everything could just be fixed with words? That saying, "I'm glad," would make him believe it. I could no longer stay silent. I stepped forward, determination in every movement. In that moment, I was no longer the person I had been. I was someone who had seen the truth and was ready to face it. And you think this will fix everything? I asked him, not hiding the contempt in my voice. You're trying to justify yourself to yourself, but it won't help you. You've already made your choice, Greg. And we all make our choices. Silence fell again in the room, and the air grew even heavier. I stood at the threshold of the gallery, and despite the storm of emotions that still tore me apart, I felt something inside me shifting. The world that once seemed clear and straightforward to me was now tainted by time, secrets, and lies. I looked at Greg, who, despite his composure, was trying to keep his gaze from mine, as if we were standing at opposite ends of an abyss, and only he didn't know how to cross it. You don't understand, he said, not moving from his spot, but his voice trembled. It's not just a deal, Aya. It's salvation. This might be the only way. I didn't let him finish. I didn't want to hear his excuses, his feelings, or how he had tried to do something, but always weakly resisted. All I felt in that moment was emptiness. No, not emptiness, but something more. The very moment when you realize that it doesn't matter how many times you try to do the right thing, in the end, you end up exactly where your own choices led you. Mom taught me a simple truth: everyone makes choices. And sometimes, even if you don't want to, you have to live with the consequences. The consequences of decisions that once didn't seem so scary. Greg's gaze was still fixed on me, and I knew that in his eyes, there was not just pity or guilt. He was afraid. He was afraid that I might now be much stronger than him, that I had already made my choice. But I didn't know yet what would come next. Emily stood behind me, her face impassive, but I saw the tension in her eyes. She listened eagerly, as each pause dragged on, as each phrase lingered, and I could swear that, despite her coldness, she felt the same thing I did, the quiet storm we had all found ourselves in. Greg's face changed, he clenched his fists, and I knew he would no longer remain silent. He said something, but I didn't listen. It was words that made no sense, words that didn't matter. They couldn't change what had already happened. I turned toward the door. My mother's words still echoed in my head, about flowers, about concrete walls, about how sometimes we grow strongest in the most unexpected places. I stepped onto the first step and paused, not looking back. I didn't know what would come next, but one thing was clear: I could never go back. In that moment, I heard only the sound of my heartbeat and the faint rhythm of my own breath. In the darkness, under my nails, I felt the cold metal of the key I had taken from the old drawer. My mother never told me what to do with it. She left it for me. And perhaps it was her final lesson. I left the gallery. The fog lay over the street like a blanket, and in that fog, I finally felt free. But somewhere, among the swirling mist, the truth that I couldn't yet see was hidden. And only time would tell what I was going to do with it.